of women who are actively involved in sex work out of their own autonomy, even though they are financially stable, is something that we have to reject and we have to stand against. This is because of the fact that most of the time, when you usually stand with these people, you usually also consolidate a lot of the rights that women are given. Like you validate a lot of anti-feminist movements that usually come. Four points of framing then before I get to argumentation. First, what is this debate then actually about? This debate is about women supporting ethically wrong things, such as plunder, such as murder, such as theft, such as assault, such as actively opting into sex work, even though you are financially capable and stable. So, what does sisterhood then look like? Then the sisterhood looks like being able to support girls. So this looks like choice feminism, where women involve themselves in sex work, even though they are financially stable and physically capable of pursuing a career choice of something else. This looks like them actively supporting and allowing for them to be objectified, and this looks like pygmies being able to be validated due to the fact that they want to subject themselves and gain male validation in a negative way. Secondly, then what is the OGC Act that's exclusive to only on OG? First, the forms of radical we would opt for forms of radical feminism where it's active critiquing of other women's choices, etc., due to for greater good. Let's say that women probably opt into sex work or women probably murder someone. On our side of the house, we would actively critique those people for engaging into these egregious activities with depending on what it is, of course. If it's morally unjust, we would most likely critique it in the first place. And we would most likely be willing to strip away some level of individual choice. And for some women, this looks like women in India, where this is due to the fact that when you look at some instances in other countries, like women in India, where marital rape is not seen as a crime, where women in Afghanistan with no autonomy to seek medical help outside of their houses, women who are actively being disenfranchised from the autonomy to get an abortion when they get raped or something else, like Nick Fentez, your body, my choice, that narrative. Thirdly, then, if CG does not bring up any unique reframing or any unique extension or any unique characterization, we think that our case is analytical prior and therefore OG places above CG. Fourthly, then, what is then the metric? The metric here is that feminism movements fight for liberty, like every social movement has to take concessions. Therefore, we think that on outside the house, as long as they prove to you that this concession is just and morally justified, we think we take this way. But before that, sure.
Yeah, so you don't want to support sex work, you don't want to support choice feminism. What exactly do you support?
Yeah. I've literally just told you I support forms of radical feminism. Okay, cool. Two arguments then in this speech. Firstly, on how we consolidate better discourse. Secondly, on what happens to women when women subject themselves to egregious forms of actions. Firstly, then, on how we consolidate better discourse. The right on our side of the house, why we much able to get better discourse and we lead to mobilize change and legislative change. Sorry, this is due to the fact when you look at the rise in traditional media wife culture that chooses that promotes women to choose to be traditional wives, where they actively opt into these specific actions that entrenches their very own rights rather than uplifting them. The autonomy of women will be redefined and will be weaponized against them in order to strip their rights by people who are anti-feminist. This looks like continuously allowing for shaming, where if women were to actively consciously opt into sex work even though they are financially stable, these people would most likely use this as an anti-rhetoric in order to target and weaponize females for wanting to actively opt into sex work for being impure or things like that generally. So the narrative dilutes discourse because you always have to think that everything is right. Therefore, your moral compass is decided and it's decided by a single narrative and it is unclear, which means in which if women were to actively stand against a certain egregious act that is caused by some specific figure, most likely, if you were to go against that, so your very own social movement would see you as going against feminism as a whole, and therefore you don't actually get the autonomy and the choice to go against something that goes against your moral compass. Comparatively on OG, you get far better choice, and you are actually actively able to critique things that are wrong, and you are able to critique things that actively harm your social movement as a whole. Therefore, there are limits to how egregious things can be before they can get critiqued, and there are limits to how bad things can be when it's not considered when it's not considered valid. Secondly, then on argumentation on how what happens when women subject themselves to these acts. Women who are in status quo subject themselves to these actions. That when they subject themselves to these actions that I've described before, you usually get far less systemic change. Why is this the case? You get far less systemic change due to the fact that you actively feed into the rhetoric and you justify as to why they are these cutting off these systemic changes are valid. Therefore, on their side of the house, you're less likely in order to get systemic change when these women in itself, when these people in itself are actively against it and are actively feeding into the reason as to why these things should be stood across. The comparative then is that they allow for individual women to regain their autonomy on our side of the house, and we get two things then. First, we get mobilized change and legislative change. Why is this the case? You get this due to the fact that when you have far better discourse regarding these things, you usually have much more of a better and clearer vision in order to justify as to why these things are wrong. What does this look like? This looks like a valid reason in order to say that abortions is valid, because due to the fact that women don't just go randomly have sex with everyone. Women are usually raped. Women are usually subjected to some level of sexual assault, and therefore this is inherently morally justified for them to be able to receive abortions. What just like how women are usually some level of traits are usually weaponized against women in the status quo, some of them are also fed into by by these women as a whole, where they opt into these egregious activities. When you allow for the chance in order to critique the very things that represent your social movement, you have a chance for far better discourse, and you have a chance to drive far better change as per compared if you allow for these things to happen and you allow for no critique at all when it comes to even the most egregious of activities, when you allow for murder, when you justify it on your side of the house, when you allow for it to represent your social movement will not stand, it will only fall. Yeah. Very good.
I'll start. 3, 2. I find it quite hilarious that OG realized the only way that they're able to win this debate is by engaging the entirety of opposition bench under our literal worst case scenario, where they say, "Oh, sisterhood is not actually about being a sister to a girl, helping girls out. No, it's about supporting women murderers." They're like, "Oh, that's the only." It's just like so funny. They realize like, oh, they're only able to critique us on this one point, and their entire best case scenario that they want to construct is that, oh, we're going to critique women for murdering people. Wow, such a strong case, guys. Anyways, 3 points of characterization. Then, what is sisterhood actually? Okay, so what sisterhood is about helping out girls, i.e., like if you were a girl at a bar, you see a girl trying to make a move on the guy, you're more likely to be a wing woman for her, for example. Or if you see like a girl stumbling around like outside of a bar, you're more likely to like help her out, maybe give her a drive home, for example. Like these are the things that sisterhood is about, supporting women, and not supporting women murderers. Like that's not exactly like the case that we're trying to go for here then. And if you were to like give like the male equivalent of this, it might be like the bro code, for example. Like you would support another guy, and for girls, we will support other girls like sister. Like this notion that, oh, I've never met you before, but you're my sister girl. We're in this together. Okay. And second point of characterization then is about like our current status quo. Recognize that we live in like a deeply patriarchal world, right? That's to say a world in which women make like 70 cents on every dollar that a man makes, for example, or where women are second guessed, where women are not platformed, where they are told to be stay-at-home mothers and to abandon their careers to become like a mother, for example. And these are the things that women have to live with. This is like a collective suffering that all women have had, like in general. This is something that all women are able to like relate to. Then, third point of characterization then is about like why feminism has to why feminism, why women should like do this. It's because of this collective shared suffering that women are more likely to be able to like empathize with other women. They're more likely to be able to like understand other women, the struggles that they go through, the things that they were forced to face throughout their entire life. They're more able to empathize with these things, and they're more likely to empathize with, let's say, like being pressured by guys to like just take another drink at the bar, for example. Like these are things they're able to empathize with, and therefore they're able to better support each other then. So our case then, we're gonna take the absolute worst case scenario. Good job, OG. We're gonna bite the bullet and say that, oh yes, sisterhood is where we unequivocally like support like every woman, regardless of the decisions they make. We're gonna take the hardest line possible here. I dare CEO to take this as well, where you're gonna support like all women regardless. And because we believe that like women are adults and they deserve to make their own decisions. Then before that, closing.
Why is empathy only available on your side? Since we're all human, we can probably all help them. I think it's something that should be done.
Sounds nice. Anyways, so the way that we're able to take that statement down is the fact that, like I mentioned just now in my characterization, women have collective shared suffering. That's to say, like, of course, like regardless of whether we have like this notion of like sisterhood or not, women are likely going to like not murder other women. What I want to say here is that women are more likely to like help other women in terms of like the things that are not necessarily like they're more likely to help them on like the smaller things per se. They're more likely to assist them, whether it be through giving them support structures, something I'll cover in my argumentation, because of this collective suffering that they're all able to relate to and therefore empathize with then at the end of the day. Moving on to my first argumentation then. It's about how you're able to get support structures you're able to get support structures for women. Three layers of analysis here. First of all, is the lack of like real alternatives for women when it comes to support structures. That's to say, like, women are not actually exactly able to like rely on like the men in their life, for example, because of the fact that they're not able to relate or empathize with the same struggles that a woman will go through. They're not exactly able to like 100% like be able to relate to these things and therefore like empathize with women on these things. And second, it's just on the collective suffering that women have faced. It means that they're better able to relate and empathize with each other. Then, second point of analysis: what does these support structures actually look like? Then it means that, like, let's say if you're a woman undergoing a pregnancy, if you're a single mother, you're more likely able to like call on like other friends that you have, and you able to know that, oh, I may have not known them for that long, but I'm able to rely on them for like life-changing advice, like how to be a better mother, for example. You're able to rely on this notion of sisterhood and think like, oh, they're there, they have my back, and they're able to support me then. Or if you were to go into a bar and you see like a bunch of women, you're able to like ask them for help if you need something, like, let's say, a drive home, for example, that sort of thing. It means you're able to like trust them more on these things, and you therefore get a support structure then for you. Third layer of analysis here is the comparative then. In a world in which you do not have this notion of sisterhood, it looks like a world in which you don't exactly have like support from other women, which is something that is exclusive under our side. Because we take the hardest stance here, that being that we support like every woman, it means that like women are just in general going to like support each other so much more. Then it means that these women are actually, they'll have this notion of sisterhood where they'll actually support each other, even if they're someone who they only like recently met. Then in the first place, like I mentioned, like all those like bar examples. Then fourth layer of analysis is on weighing about how we're able to like get better outcomes for women in general, because like it's quite intuitive. No, if you're a woman, now you have more support structures, you're able to have more people who are able to help you in the first place. You have more people who are able to call on for help, for advice, for anything in your life. It means that because we prove to you like the lack of like a proper alternative for women to actually be able to get support structures from other places, in a world in which you don't have this notion, they lose their only support structure then at the end of the day. Before that, opening.
What is the delineation between a helpful homie and the notion of sisterhood in feminism?
Helpful homie, I said a guy?
Versus, no, women. Versus just sisterhood in feminism.
Sisterhood is about girls helping girls. Homiehood is about guys helping guys. Anyways, moving on to my just a few rebuttals I have here. Okay, OG tries to bring to you these points about how you get better discussions under their side, because of the fact that you're able to platform like feminism more, because you end up aligning yourself less with like these more controversial like takes or opinions, or with controversial women at the end of the day. This is simply like principally unjust for a few reasons. Number one, what is the purpose of feminism, guys? It's trying to get more rights, trying to help women, trying to give more support to women. At the point at which you abandon women as the literal feminism woman, that is the point in which we have failed as a woman. That is the point in which you have failed to protect your fellow, not me lah, but your fellow women lah. You're not able to protect, to fulfill your mission objective. Oh, we want to help these people then. And you may argue then that, oh, but at least we're able to help more women because we become more palatable then. We ask you then, when does the delineation then end? At what point do you say like, oh, we're going to compromise on this much just so that we're able to platform our own platform to reach out to like more people? What I mean by this is in that how much are you going to give up in order to make your feminism movement more palatable? Because it's something that's inherently impalatable to our patriarchal society. It's not something you're actually able to give up that much on at the end of the day. So for all those reasons,
Thank you. It is ironic that all spends 2 minutes accusing us of having them defend the worst case, and then later on, pushing us that absolutely running the softest case line possible, where you simply just possibly pass another woman a pad when they're on their period. I think later then they try to frame this that they are taking on the worst case scenario. But notice that, and on your notes itself, that they don't actually do this as a whole. What I'm going to do in this speech is two main things. The first, in terms of recharacterization and having opposition bench actually deal with the framing that we posited from first. And the second is in terms of two main contentions, in terms of what is the main metric this round should be judged upon. Firstly, then I want to deal with what specifically Sisterhood meant by. I want to deal with OO's characterization then. OO claims that it was simply just being a helpful person. But we think that as individual human beings, you all have empathy instilled with you as an individual. Whether it was to assuage yourself of your individual guilt or it was just simply an empathetic, visceral reaction, we think that's all still possible on government bench. Specifically then, the difference between being a helpful individual and just wanting to help someone and the notion of sisterhood in feminism was specifically how sisterhood in feminism made it permissible for choice feminism to be a thing that you had to defend in totality. Therefore, what opposition bench actually had to defend in this round was choice feminism in totality. This is when women conduct sex work. This is when they actively go out and do these things despite being financially capable of seeking forms of other jobs. This is when their individual actions actually impacted the lives of other women, where we framed out women in India cannot actually escape themselves from marital rape. All of their objectification that happens in the status quo is something that actively harms women in disenfranchised communities. That was the point of the case that LO failed to engage with. Secondly, that the choice in which these individuals conduct actively harms people. Therefore, our counterfactual was actually forms of proper discourse. They never dealt with our mechanistic analysis coming within the argument. They simply tried to frame us out of this round. What we specifically told you was that radical feminism meant actually engaging in discourse with other women. This is when you needed to discuss whether or not actions were specifically okay. Because sisterhood claimed in totality that it was okay to do these things, even though it was your choice, even if it harmed other women out there, as long as it was a choice by women, we had to defend it. That is what opposition bench needed to defend in the very first place. It was not just helping out a woman, it was not just being a wingman for them. Thirdly, then, while we are unable to draw a specific line in terms of what is permissible, we think the difference that actually exists is that sisterhood on their side of the house was acting in totality. Our side of the house needed to critique each individual action because social movements were inherently based on critiquing your own actions in terms of how you want to achieve systematic change. The side that actually posited systematic change came from OG. You heard nothing from LO thus far. Moving on into the metric then for this round. While all claims that they are able to just help women in the vacuum, OJ tells you that you're able to, number one, get systematic change. Number two, you're able to combat stereotypes that historically prevailed and that women are unable to escape from. This is when you have trad wife as a culture that is increasingly rising because of choice feminism online, where it was okay to subject yourself to the man. You always just had to stay home. You always wanted to live this life, being a birth giver, being like the machine for like the patriarchy itself. This was what was permissible in opposition, and this is what OG never stood for in the very first place. Two main contentions in this speech then. Which side actually gets more systematic change? And secondly, in terms of the internal support structures, directly contending with LO. The first then is how we are able to get better systematic change. In the crucial weighing here is that our side actually proves why discourse likely is going to happen for two main reasons. Number one, you do not side with everything a woman says. And this is specifically when you're able to critique each other, when you needed to have discourse, where certain actions were okay or not, sisterhood inherently barred all of these things out because you weren't being a sister if you're critiquing another woman. That is the rhetoric the opposition had to defend. Rather than outside the house, you actually have women thinking and critical discourse happening online, happening in person. No, thank you. I'll take you after this contention. Is that this is specifically when you're able to actually think about what is the best choice in order to empower movements. Because movements were never just cohesive in the first place. Even the suffragettes went through different forms of discourse. You needed to actually decide which one was better for systematic change. You actually needed to negotiate for all of these things. We're able to empower the women themselves. Specifically, that is why you're able to get some forms of grassroots change that are able to build up in the long term, where individuals understand that maybe my actions contribute towards the objectification of women on a large scale. Because note that if you are in a patriarchal society that most countries and most liberal democracies are still in now, each individual action is able to affect the men around you, is able to affect the society around you. This is going to act as a domino effect. This is when it eventually builds up. So in our side of the house, when you actually have individual women's actions in check, you are able to actually analyze whether it's beneficial or not. This is when you actively change it. And it's when you can actually collectively get collective change. Yes.
Regardless of political belief, in which world are women more likely to vote for Kamala Harris?
So I think that's mainly just not that important in this round. But I really think that if you want to say that all women voting for Kamala Harris without thinking at all is sisterhood, we think that no, it's just a liberal choice either way. So you cannot just throw out political ideology and then ask us, would you pick red or blue? Like that is political ideology. The second point then is in terms of internal support. This was OO's main fallback in this round. I want to note that simply helping out a woman being a wingman, like helping them out at the bar, is not sisterhood. Sisterhood is inherently siding with them no matter what happened. On our side of the house, we told you why this is unlikely to happen. I want to do two things here then. Number one, we're able to weigh this, and number two, we're able to co-opt this. Number one, weighing this, is it more important for you to have a wingman, or is it more important for you as the feminism movement, or like able to build up the feminist movement and actually get legislative change? This is when you are able to get your abortion rights back. This is when you're able to reconsider the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This is when you're able to actually walk on the street without being catcalled or having to fear for your life. When women can actually walk out alone at night. All of these things were more important than maybe getting a wingman. The second is in terms of how we're able to call this. We think internal support still happens, but why was it important to the question for opposition bench is why was it important for other women to support your problematic actions? Why was it important for a woman to support another woman's problematic actions that actively infringe on your own individual autonomy? This is the question towards opposition bench, and I think CO also has to respond towards this if they cannot run another framing different from opening opposition. Therefore, then on two things OG wins on. The first is in terms of how we are able to actually critique each other and get systematic change. The second is how we are able to co-opt internal support, and therefore we are able to actually grow a better feminism movement and collectivize women as a whole.
It is ironic that this opening government team identifies the many different fractions that exist within the feminist movement and say, in a world where we have intellectual discourse, we're more likely to get all these arguing factions together to get kind of legislative change. I think in a world where they accept that women can choose between the types of women they want to support, the types of feminist ideology they want to support, they have to accept that not all these different factions are going to agree, and they are going to split the support based on that side of the house. I think that is worse off for the feminist movement to fight for positive change, worse off for the collectivization of political capital and getting all of the legislation that they wanted to achieve on that side of the house. Let's first look at whether women should pick and choose between different women, right? Because that's the narrative that we have to support. Just in terms of clarification, I think that the narrative of sisterhood, the notion of sisterhood that girls should support girls everywhere, extends everywhere. So it can be at the bar. When you see a girl that's swaying outside the bar, you are going to help her on the basis that you are a woman. And I will just point out that in that side of the house, if this person is particularly selfish, that it might not be a reason for them to help on that side of the house. But I'm also happy to defend all the worst forms and all the different people you don't agree with, very questionable, controversial figures outside of the house under the notion of sisterhood, we're very happy to support those things as well. I think that's required in us by the motion. And I think that while it's fair for them to say that you have some kind of positive relationship, positive what's that desire to help, I think they have to accept there's going to be less support on that side of the house. The OG says that sex work is offensive, so because they engage in sex work or like I don't know start an OnlyFans account while they have the financial capacity to earn. And basically they say that this is not something that women within the feminist movement like and support, and therefore they should not have to support it. But they don't really ever explain why that's the case. Like, why is it that just because you don't believe in sex work, for example, you don't believe in the choices that another woman makes, then you basically don't support this person and you leave them to die in the greater scheme of all of the challenges that women all around the world have to face. Because I think that there's much greater challenges facing women in feminism. In a world where women earn like 70 cents for every dollar that a man earns, in a world where women would rather go into a woods with a bear than a man, because how little they trust a man to protect them and to keep them safe. In a world where date rape, harassment, predatory behavior abound, in a world where there's a constant underestimation of ability and the denial of promotion to women on the sole basis of their gender and things like that. I think it is in this world that the opening government says we ought to care about the differences between sex work and whether or not we should support those women, rather than to collectivize and to address all of the problems that women are facing today. I just think that this does not make sense in any way whatsoever. You need to have effective support structures, you need to have solidarities, and you need to put these petty differences aside if women are ever going to protect each other and going to help each other push forward against the patriarchal system. The opening government says you can still help them as homies, for example. My first question later, like, will you though? Like, if you hate sex workers that much, if you think that they're the scum of the earth, are you really going to help them? Like those kinds, like that, another girl staying outside the bar. If you don't know that particular girl, if you maybe hate her because she wore the same top as you or something like that, will you actually go and help her? I'm not sure. The lack of a direct connection, you have personal selfish incentives. You may not have empathy for this particular person. You may be apathetic, or you may just be tired. These are all of the reasons as to why, on their side of the house, women are not obligated to help these other women. And they might not always help. I'm happy to accept sometimes they will help other women regardless. I'm saying comparatively, they get less help because there's any number of reasons for women not to help others. It is only in a world where this notion exists, where this norm is pushed from the top down and all women say we should support other women, where you're likely to get all support in all of these instances. The next thing the OG says is that supporting all girls means there's no discourse inside the movement, because apparently you now have to support all women regardless of their beliefs and you can never discuss them. I'm just not sure why this is true. I do not understand why you cannot have discussions about these issues privately. I would note that feminist theorists and scholars have discussions, they publish articles in journal papers all the time. They can point out different aspects of feminism that they may agree or not disagree with, at the same time supporting each other and saying, I respect your difference in opinion and I still support you regardless. It is deeply unclear why you cannot have any kind of meaningful discourse in the world of opposition. Second, even if you don't discuss this issue later, what exactly is the harm? Like, you don't support sex, you don't talk about the nuances of sex work, and you support sex workers regardless. What's the problem? Why can you not support them? Why can you not recognize the greater challenges that feminism face and still support those women regardless? I think on a comparative, at best, let's assume that they get some kind of meaningful discussion. I don't think that's necessarily true that these different factions are going to engage with each other. But assuming that they do, support is not guaranteed. They might fight each other, but regardless of how things work out, they are going to split the support structure, which means you are less likely going to get legislative change and all the good things that come from that. We're happy to defend the worst side of opposition. Yes, you support other women without discourse. We will support it through solidarity and strength in numbers, because we will argue that whether you support sex work or not, women standing together and standing up for equal rights is better for women all around the world. That is much better work for women. That side of the house, but what about problematic women? We're happy to support those things as well. I think that majority of the women we have to support are just controversial figures, but if we have to cop that burden, we're happy to defend it. Is there anything from closing, by the way?
Is it more important to get support from girls or from structures?
Both. I'm now going to tell you in substantive how is it that you're better able to mobilize political and financial capital for feminism. So I think that the notion of sisterhood is pervasive. And if the feminist movement supports it, and feminist leaders affirm it, and women and allies will also affirm it, then they also have to act in line with the things that they say. And if they say that they support girls regardless, they're much more likely to continue, they're much more likely to do so. This is important because this notion is required to mobilize capital that otherwise would not be mobilized. If you support women, that is now a notion or an onus on you to go out and vote for them, right? Whether you agree with Kamala Harris or not, you should vote for her because her in power is much, much better for women as well as the entire country. You will give money to them, you will platform women and use your power and privilege to help the fight for gender equity. And this notion is particularly important because it affects women in privilege and power, those that are mostly insulated from like the worst forms of microaggression, misogyny, and stuff like that. These are people who have the capacity to help, like women or organizations in the first world that have a lot of money and funding that they can give to the developing world rather, but they may not necessarily have the incentive, the interest to do it. In a world where this notion exists, you put the obligation on women to help others, you're much more likely to mobilize this kind of capital. On a comparative, without the notion of sisterhood, women can pick and choose the kind of causes that they support. Maybe they don't support sex work in that side. Maybe that group feels alienated and they won't support it. This allows conservatives to exploit the fractionalization that exists inside the movement. It is harder for the movement to collectively move for positive legislation, easier for them to fractionalize, split political support base, hard bad worse for women everywhere. Very proud to oppose.
Right. Thank you. Oh no, everyone, you can take the time.
I find it odd how OG wants to empower women, and in the same breath, they belittle women for every minute choice that they make, be it sex worker or otherwise, right? OG essentially says three problematic things. Firstly, that the sisterhood movement or sisterhood notion validates anti-feminist movements. This is also problematic. This is something that we're probably going to be vertically extending on far more because OG doesn't do much work to explain the structures and how exactly this all operates. Secondly, actively critique this woman. This, first of all, it's not a value judgment motion. You have to hate all. You don't necessarily have to hate all of these moments at the same time. It's a regrets motion. There's probably two different scenarios in which you have to prioritize. Is it better that before sisterhood existed or after the fact? And thirdly, that these malicious women harm society. This doesn't tell you, first of all, that these things are necessarily harmful to what extent and to what effect, that what necessarily the effects are of these things. And OG essentially is far too extreme. The more realistic depiction of this regret motion is probably what CG is going to tell you, that it's a world where you just don't support. You don't necessarily have to actively persecute these individuals or say that sex workers are bad. If you want to be a sex worker, it's probably up to you. I just don't care and I don't really support you. Do your own thing, right? So OG tried to prove a literal autocracy with sisterhood as opposed to a regret motion. This is why they fall. Because what you want is to just not support these individuals as opposed to ostracizing them and then causing opening opposition's problems to then materialize, i.e. you don't get any support from women in and of itself. So CG is distinct from OG because later on we're going to be emphasizing the impact of the absence of this notion to feminism as opposed to society at large, because OG doesn't really talk about how it pertains as to feminist motion in particular. So what is the context, right? Probably sisterhood often involves blind support, that women should unite and support each other no matter what, irrespective of the differences that they have, etc. Feminism, on the other hand, is to fight for women's rights. The distinguishment here is important because in order for feminism to be effective, sisterhood has to be compatible with it. But the unfortunate reality is that sisterhood, because it is too over-encompassing in everything that it does, also includes the fringes of society, also includes individuals who fight for things such as apa tu nama dia, taking everything that the man has after the divorce, or necessarily abusing a man because she doesn't like what he's saying, cheating as much as you want because it's something that's doable just because your husband isn't making you happy, all of these things are the necessary metrics by which this debate revolves around, not necessarily women shooting people, because if you are a person and you shoot a person, that's already bad. You don't have to be a woman for people to tell you that. So sisterhood in this instance is the normalization of behaviors that are problematic at best, at worst and at best. So in order to persuade society and be seen as morally right and supportable, you need to be willing to acknowledge wrongs despite this motion, despite the fact that there are individuals who are at the fringes of society, like what OO is trying to defend. You have to convince the lawmakers and organizations to associate themselves with you, so you have critical mass to get this change in the first place, which is what OG doesn't prove to you. What are the things that feminism is fighting for necessarily before I get to my arguments? Firstly, things like boss girl and cupcake feminism, alongside the cheating stuff that I mentioned just now. These are the extremes. Also, equal pay, voting rights, and equality. Unfortunately, number 2, 3, and 4 usually gets ostracized by the first, otherized by the first one, because those are the ones that are often blown out of proportions and seen as unnecessary by these women. So, two arguments then. Firstly, why sisterhood causes the feminist movement to regress. The debate isn't about palatability, it's about traction. Because while opposition says that sisterhood probably means more intersectional feminism, the reason for legislative change doesn't care about your intersectional feminism. In order for you to get any form of change for any woman ever, you have to make it so that the structures themselves are going to want to listen to you. And how exactly does this happen? Firstly, legislative change happens through you voicing out these things. This requires you to have at least critical mass and for you to be able to have a large amount of number to convince people otherwise. Secondly, to convince, to rally, and to lobby. Same thing applies to the voicing out thing. And thirdly, probably the law does not negotiate with criminals or radical groups, which is what OG literally is. Regressing then is threefold. Firstly, how does it regress? It's threefold. Sisterhood causes at least a association with harmful aspects of the movement. So, ability for you to voice out is reliant on critical mass and support. So yes, palatability is important, but only because it leads to traction. In the instance that you have individuals who do not look at your movement in a very positive light, you're probably not going to have them on your side. You're not going to get the very important critical mass that either OO or OG doesn't prove, right? So individuals and corporations need to want to associate with you. If they don't, if you make it so that they aren't interested to, then they're probably not going to get that critical mass. Your movement is tarnished then. Secondly, pushes away potential supporters, reducing critical mass. TJ's response to my POI was insufficient when I told him, is it more important to get girl support or the structures? Because you have to make a trade-off. You can't be so convenient to say just that we're going to be able to get everything. It's debating. You have to take trade-offs. The reality is that probably under their side, what's likely to happen is that they are going to trade off some semblance of structural change or structural convincing or critical mass, and in turn get more feminists or girls that are supporting them. This is harmful because you have to make this trade-off to be able to get any change structurally. Yes.
If women of color being exploited is not a group of people that politicians support, would the feminist movement in your world throw them under the bus to create friends in politics?
Like I said, support or don't support. For women of color doesn't necessarily mean that just because they are being discriminated, we're going to support that discrimination. This doesn't fall under sisterhood. This doesn't fall under what is not sisterhood either. What is more likely is that if you're doing something harmful, we don't support you. If you are being discriminated, we're probably going to support you. So if you're being discriminated by the politicians, you won't want to listen to them because most people will realize and then they're going to riot and then burst or whatever. Thirdly, empowered to do more wrong things. We flip the support structure argument on OO because in order for you to be empowered, you have to allow sisterhood to be able to be enacted. Because in this instance, you then cause echo chambers to exist. You allow people to be empowered and rightened to do whatever harmful things they were doing in the first place. So LO gives the POI of women need to vote for Kamala. Okay, how about women or anyone just needs to vote for whoever is the best individual at hand, as opposed to blindly voting and hoping that something good is coming out of it. Impacts then are twofold. Firstly, it reduces critical thought and it ostracizes other individuals. Argument number 2, no sisterhood equals to better accountability. Firstly, it's much likelier for microaggressions and misogyny that TJ just talk about to be rampant when you allow the fringes of society to fester. If you do not call these individuals out, you're not going to be able to prevent them from continuing to exercise these harmful and malicious behaviors. So firstly, the ability to call out malicious individuals is unique under government side. During the women's suffrage, women who retaliated under individuals who were suppressing them were empowered, and people who did so in a bad way were like called out necessarily. Secondly, critical mass, and thirdly, you're easier able to convince due to lobbying and advocacy. Thank you.
If you're a woman in the 1950s, I think empathy towards women is not intuitive. It's not something that just happens without collectivization because the oppression of women was so normalized back then. The exploitation of women was so normalized back then that a lot of things that government tries to talk about falls then. Why is this the case? One thing we need to note here, this is a regrets motion, which means that what they have to talk about then is why is it then since the start of feminism, this notion of sisterhood or this collectivization of women as a whole is something that is not necessary, and it's not necessary to get a lot of the change that you try to talk about now, because they try to talk about things like structural change, but at the end of the day, without the support from women, then I think you're unlikely to get it in the first place. I think then that's where here's where CEO enters the debate. We're talking about two main things. Firstly, why you get more buy-in from both men and women, and why this is likely going to be your only way to get any form of change. But secondly, why you help the marginalized communities or the most vulnerable people in society. Firstly, then I think this idea of hard stance, soft stance, uncharitable, blah blah blah, is unnecessary. So we will bite the bullet here. If we have to take a hard stance, we will just take a hard stance, because I think our case, like this idea, like is like it's irrelevant to like the arguments that we are going to be giving to you, right? But firstly, I think I just want to clarify that sisterhood is not just about small things, right? It's also just going to be things like centering your movement around collectivizing women, around having solidarity towards women, around preaching. So it's not just probably not just like giving a tampon, but probably things like, oh, when you see women outside of your community like have suffering, you helping them because you understand that they are women also, and you have to like and you have like an obligation to do so within your sisterhood. But I think second, like it's one thing we forget also is that feminism is multifaceted, right? Just because you preach sisterhood doesn't mean you have to forget about lobbying for change or forget about lobbying for structural change, right? I think then on this notion itself, CG is off the debate, because if you want to talk about structural change, I think we can get some structural change with with collect solidarity, but structural change cannot last without solidarity and without changing people's mentality and perspectives of things. Okay, this brings me to my first argument then on why this helps you help marginalized communities. I think it's very simple. The idea of sisterhood itself is about protecting all women. It's about helping any women that you see, whether it's just a woman on the street that you don't know or one I think has been agreed upon. But what the government forgets, or some there are some of the house, the feminism that they're likely going to see, this radical feminism, this quote unquote radical feminism they're likely going to see, is likely going to be like white women feminism or the most liberal form of feminisms that you see in like liberal countries now, right? But why is this bad? I think we've already seen how because of this they don't have a lot of lobbying power to lobby later to lobby for like change outside or like to like more vulnerable communities like people that are I can't think of it. Like people in India, for example, that don't have the privilege to have this radical form of feminism because likely they are so heavily silenced. But what this means is that only with any form of some form of solidarity can women in liberal societies at the very least understand that they have an obligation to help their sisters in these other vulnerable countries as these like more conservative countries as well. Which is why on our side of the house, I think the way you approach feminism or the way you approach change, like helping women is likely going to be different. But what does this look like? I think this one looks like probably giving grassroots help to women in these states because you understand that they need help too. Instead of just focusing on your stuff and your problem. Because I think like this general idea of white women like the feminism is more catered towards women themselves. It more catered towards me myself and the problems that I face as a woman, the oppression that I face as a woman, rather than the problems that society faces as a whole, and the problem that generally like affects like a lot of women, right? So I think likely then is when you're going to mobilize funding and you're going to actually help people, or you're likely going to go down, or you're just going to do things like advocate for change. You're going to advocate for like the women in like these conservative areas in the first place. But also, it's just the idea of making support conditional, making the support towards women conditional in these areas would have taken away any form of change that you've had in the past, any form of change that you've made in the past. But secondly, I want to talk about the idea of why you are likely to have more buy-in on our side of the house. I think it's very simple. Certain actions that are fought for, so as are actually foreign, right? I think if you ask a woman 50 years ago, the right to vote was probably not at the forefront of their mind. Because at the end of the day, these are things that is actually foreign to them. Then what do they care about? What will make them buy into your movement? It is likely you supporting them. It's likely you wanting to create a community for them. This is how you create buy-in from women, and this is when you're able to provide a community. Because at the end of the day, oh, so this is when you're able to like reach women everywhere, and this is the only way you're able to gain the mass and gain the support to have any form of lobbying change, right? But secondly, let's just talk, like I'm just gonna just talk about men really quickly, because I don't think this is likely going to threaten men or like make men far worse, right? Because at the end of the day, what we have to concede is if you're seen as an if men antagonize you and these men hold positions of power, then your lobbying power and your ability to be heard by these men that are in power is likely to be so much more lesser. Now, why exactly is it that you're seen as less of a threat? I think because the efforts of feminism is more from internal. It's about you supporting and growing your community from within, rather than trying to externally try to fight men or like make it seem like you're taking away their rights, right? What this means is when you emphasize on things like support from within and internal change, then when men are likely to likely to try to listen to you, or at least not try to immediately shut you out. We see this in cases like conservative countries. I forgot which country, where like when women are trying to like preach feminist values. I'm sorry, I have a lot to say. You can ask take my from my later. Okay, when men try to when women try to preach like feminism in like extremely conservative countries, men immediately shut them out. They lock them at home. They burn them on stakes or whatever shit. Right? I think that's precisely why it's important that you have some form of like appeal towards men, or at least don't make them your enemy, because this is when you're likely going to be extremely harmful. But I want to talk about structural change. Because if structural change is the only impact coming from them, we take them down. Because structural change is temporary. We see this in the way Roe v. Wade was overturned despite decades and decades of fighting in the past. Because at the end of the day, if people don't agree with your movement, people don't agree with the message you're trying to put out, if you don't have supporters trying to lobby for these things or continuously supporting this, if this social climate or like this political climate is one that disagrees with you, that's when they will constantly fight to take down the structures that protect women. But secondly, you can still find loopholes. The gender pay gap is illegal, but in most corporations, you still see it being implemented in some form or way. Because at the end of the day, structural change cannot protect women from things like that. But thirdly, it's also the fact that if you don't change, like the most vulnerable women are not women that are oppressed by structures. It is women that are oppressed by men. It's women that are oppressed by their fathers that don't let them leave the house, that don't let them get education. It's if their husbands that don't let them go to work or don't give them any form of rights in the first place, don't like these are all the people that we should protect. I think that's precisely why we take this debate. Because not only do we protect the most people, but we also protect the most vulnerable people, marginalized communities. But we prove to you that in the long term and in the past, without sisterhood, you are likely not going to be able to get any form of change. But we are the only side that has some semblance of certainty of outcome. Because structural change is probably still like uncertain. But what we tell you certainly is that when you're able to help women and you're able to like actually support them, then you have some form of support that protects them for all these reasons. CO.
Alright. Back to the top. Okay, then you gotta go.
I think Gauss' bench argument on that women would engage in morally wrong things. I guess in that context, they were giving examples of sex work. It's just like non-comparative. I don't think this is something that's unique to their side, right? I don't think it's even logical in the first place. The first is because women have a moral compass, right? I don't think that certain things that are really morally wrong, like killing your husband, for example, would be supported regardless of whether the feminist movement supports it or not. I think this is just something you just won't engage in. But also, social structures already prevent this sort of things or sort of mold women into not doing things in the first place. I'm unsure as to why suddenly you would just wake up one day and say, you know what, sex work is the best course of action I want to take. But I think the more pressing issue here is that the counterfactual is that if it's harmful and it's not okay, what metric do you gauge it as unokay, right? Maybe in the West it's something that, oh, sex work is unokay, but I think it's even worse on like conservative countries, right? But on your side of the house, I'm likely to believe that in a liberal country, sex work is something that's viewed as okay. In a conservative, it's not. That's only for sex work. But what about certain women rights? For example, being able to receive an education. Maybe in a liberal sense, women are able to do that. But what about in a more conservative sense? If women want to receive education, by what metric is it viewed as okay or not? Maybe doing sex work in the West is just, no, thank you. Doing sex work in the West is just as bad as women getting education in the East. I'm unsure as to why this metric is suddenly what you use to weigh what women do is good or not, and why suddenly women would start ostracizing other women and therefore lead to systemic change. I'll talk about that later, right? The reason that this is very toxic is because social structures or prevailing patriarchal centered structures are the likely metrics where this is converted to, where this is likely weighed upon, right? So, for example, if let's say the man dictated that women should stay at home, it's likely that if women get out of the house, they're going to be viewed as, oh, wrong, and therefore the social movement would also want to stand with men and say, hey, this is something that's wrong because it doesn't go against traditional values. I'm unsure as to why the feminist people calling out other feminist movement calling out women within the feminist movement would not be seen as just some sort of conservatism. What is the separating metric? I don't think mechanization is provided. I don't think I can buy it. But also, I think the differences specifically are why the cherry picking of feminism marginalized the most vulnerable in this debate. We tell you in Durgha speech specifically that by supporting all women, including women from conservative societies, which is where the debate ought to take place, by the way, is the most important in this debate. Yeah, also on systematic change, right? I think the collective where they talked about the collective critiquing of women's actions, there's two layers to this. The first is maybe in a more liberal society this doesn't make sense, this doesn't harm women because you're just critiquing, you're not actually doing anything. But in a more conservative society where this active critiquing is already going, where these women are already marginalized, it's going to look like men stoning women to death for doing something that they do not want, for doing something that they want to do, right? I'm unsure of how you protect these women in the most conservative societies. You're going to marginalize them even more. You're going to subject them to bodily harm, or in the worst case, death. No, thank you. In the context where where it is the likely place that this debate takes place, which is the conservative place, conservative, yeah, nations, the change can only come in a collective support of just women itself. Questions the very oppressive structures that put them there in the first place. I'm unsure as to why now half of the women that should have been standing with you now stands with men, starts oppressing you, and suddenly you can start galvanizing for change. Where does this come from? I don't see any mechanization. I cannot buy this. But here's where we win, right? OO engages in a world where systemic change may or may not happen. We tell you that we don't care about systemic change. Fuck the system. What we care about is that women stand together in a community. You can rely back on people that support you no matter what you do. You understand that these structures are in place to be there for you. Yeah, closing.
Oh. TJ says if politics deems it as bad, TJ will throw it away. But you would support someone being discriminated regardless of you being discriminated, being a feminist, as opposed to supporting someone who is discriminating. How is empathy and support mutually?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about it later, right? Durgha proves to you that this really isn't about the change that happens, it's about the safety net that feminism has been able to consistently provide throughout the ages. Talking about that clash right now, right? I think the main clash is the impacts of what was just said was on what reverses feminism's progress. If you stand with feminism, even regardless of what they do, whether it's wrong or not, you're probably going to reverse the progress that has been made so far. OG posits that the radical actions will infringe on the autonomy of other women within the movement. No, thank you. The comparative that OG fails to understand is that it will be men going against this very movement already. It is already extremely hard for the feminist movement to even get change in the first place. By calling women from the movement itself, it reverses the progress, right? So they tell us that for you standing with your own women, supporting any form of things that they do reverses sort of progress. We tell you that you also reverse progress because when you call out women within your own movement, you are you're just fracturing the fractions apart. Here's why Durga's point on the safe haven or a community movement is important. Even if in the worst case scenario is that we lose out on certain progress, we still retain the fact that women can still view other women as a community instead of questioning the very integrity of the feminist movement in the first place. Insofar as we prove to you that when you stand with men or within conservative structures in the first place, why should women still view you as part of support? You already support the very structures that are oppressing them in the first place. Sure, I'll take you.
Why wouldn't the women in the 1950s then just support other women who choose to submit to the patriarchy then if you were to so against fractionalization and critiquing?
That's the thing about feminism, right? It's support of everything. If you want to submit to the patriarchy, sure, you do you. If you want to go against the patriarchy, you do you. In your side of the house, you're cherry picking. You're telling me, oh, this is wrong. This is right. And I'm telling you that the picking of what's wrong and what's right is tied down to the social structures or tied down to the patriarchal structures already in place. That's why it's so harmful. And I've already talked about that. Now, talking about CG tells you that sisterhood is not part of feminism. I think that's not the case. I think sisterhood is the analytically prior premise to any form of feminism. It is just women coming together and saying, hey, we should band together and go against something, or we should support each other in such hard times, right? Insofar as Durgha have proven to you why this is the only thing that can happen in a more conservative society, I'm unsure as to why feminism and sisterhood is something totally different. Cupcake or something else feminism is something that the liberal world has posited after sisterhood feminism. It's the prior thing to any form of feminism after. Insofar as support is needed, I think we have been the only house that can sustainably provide support to other women without getting any sort of pushback from existing structures. The structural change that opening wants to engage with is essentially going to just be just going to push back any form of change that has already happened. Men are going to be more threatened. I think Durga's speech already deals with that. I think this is also the only metric that the debate can be won upon, because we are the only house that guarantees an actual impact even in our worst case scenario, which is better than all the other houses. All those reasons proud to oppose.